Welcome to this program in the Our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walter Gable. This program deals with the Erie Canal, and there will be a companion segment that will deal with other canals in the Greater Finger Lakes area that were so important in our area history. Canals played a very important part in the rapid and huge economic development of the Finger Lakes region in the decades before the Civil War. The Erie Canal was clearly the most important of all of the canals in the Finger Lakes. Probably all of you can remember in your elementary grades or maybe 7th grade history how you learned the words of this song, 15 years on the Erie Canal. I'll explain the meaning of Low Bridge and the reference to 15 later in the presentation. This map illustrates how the Erie Canal joined the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. You can see how this Erie Canal will open up the entire Great Lakes as well as upstate New York for economic and population growth. Note also at the top the comment by Jessie Hawley that this was the longest canal built in the least time, with the least experience, for the least money, and for the greatest public utility of any other canal in the world. At the time that Jessie Hawley made this comment at the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, there had been operating canals in Europe and a major one in China for many decades. These two quotes suggest the real importance of the Erie Canal. The one quote at the top by a person involved in the building of the Erie Canal. He says, "No single act, no public measure, except the Declaration of Independence and the formation of the United States Constitution, has done so much to promote the public prosperity and produce a new era in the history of the country as the construction of the Erie Canal." The bottom quote is by a contemporary historian. He says the Erie Canal was the work of that remarkable generation in America who made the period between 1815 and 1860 an age of great national expansion. And that was happening here in our Finger Lakes. If you look at this physical map of the eastern United States, you can easily see the most logical route to build a canal to connect the eastern coastal region with the area west of the Appalachian Mountains was either through the southern coastal plain or through the Mohawk Valley of central New York. Obviously, the Mohawk Valley route was the more logical one for several reasons. This route could make use of the Hudson River and the Mohawk River. Second, this route was closer to where the population of the then United States was concentrated, the area from Virginia north into New England. And lastly, this route was closer to the Great Lakes, which would more easily open up much of the West. Here you see a physical map that shows the route of this proposed canal to connect the Hudson River with the Great Lakes. The real decision that had to be made was whether to connect with Lake Ontario or with Lake Erie. This slide shows the other Greater Finger Lakes area canals that had connections with the Erie Canal. These other canals in the Greater Finger Lakes area will be talked about in another segment of our Finger Lakes history. It was as early as 1724 that some individuals had talked about creating a canal to connect the Hudson River with the Great Lakes. Jessie Hawley, shown at upper right, wrote in 1807 and 1808 about how in 1805 he first conceived the idea of an overland canal route while he was in the Seneca Falls office of Willimus Minders. Minders is shown at lower left. The real force behind establishing the Erie Canal was New York State Governor DeWitt Clinton, shown here. As early as 1808, a New York legislator named Joshua Furman went to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Thomas Jefferson to get federal government funding for a canal, but he was unsuccessful. That same year, surveyor James Geddes was commissioned by the New York State Legislature to explore options of a canal to Lake Ontario and a canal to Lake Erie. In April of 1811, the New York State Legislature passed its first canal law authorizing private companies to organize canals. In February of 1817, Governor Daniel Tompkins resigned as governor, and DeWitt Clinton became governor. He was an ardent canal advocate. Early in 1817, the New York State Legislature approved a construction of an Erie Canal, and Governor Clinton will ceremonially break ground on the construction of this Erie Canal on July 4th of that same year. Now for some basic facts about the Erie Canal. Critics at the time called this canal derisively Clinton's Ditch or Clinton's Folly because they thought it was an extravagant waste of New York State finances, and they blamed Governor Clinton for pushing so hard for its creation. The original canal was 364 miles long, and it connected Lake Erie with the Hudson River. In that 364 miles, there were 83 locks and 18 aqueducts. An aqueduct carries the water of the Erie Canal over streams such as the Genesee River and Rochester, as well as carrying the canal over ravines and so on. The locks were necessary because there's an elevation change of 568 feet from the Hudson River to Lake Erie, and the bottom visual shows this great change in elevation. The construction of the Erie Canal cost approximately $7 million. As early as October 1819, a 25-mile section of the canal opened. Then there was a 75-mile section of the canal between Syracuse and Rome, opened July 4th, 1820. By the end of 1823, the canal was opened between Rochester and Albany. Now, it was on October 26, 1825, that a few boats, including the Seneca chief, carrying Governor DeWitt Clinton and some very important dignitaries, left Buffalo to travel the entire length of the Erie Canal and then down the Hudson River to the Atlantic Ocean at the New York City harbor. After 9 days, on November 4th, 1825, there was the so-called Wedding of the Waters ceremony, where Governor DeWitt Clinton ceremoniously dumped water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean at the New York City harbor. This map shows the Erie Canal corridor. For many years, this Erie Canal corridor and the Hudson River Valley, including New York City, was the location of 90% of New York State's population. Here you see the fact that the Erie Canal was built in sections. The area from Seneca County, Cayuga County boundary east to Utica was chosen as the first section of the canal to be built, as it was the area requiring the fewest locks because it was the most level area. Now, this area had been originally forested, and there were many trees that had to be cleared. And you have to remember that the Erie Canal was constructed by people who were not college-trained engineers, because such college engineering training really didn't exist at that time. There were people in charge who made use of what became known as Yankee Ingenuity to come up with practical solutions to problems. One of these problems was that the tree stumps had to be cleared from the path of the canal. So a kind of stump puller, shown here, had to be invented. A team of oxen would pull the rope that was wound around the center wheel axle. Note that the two outer wheels were braced so that they couldn't move when the oxen pulled on that rope. There was another rope tied to the tree stump and the axle of the wheels. When the oxen pulled their rope, the center wheel turned the axis so much that the stump just popped out of the ground. For the portions of the canal route that had to be dug by human physical labor, the canal was to be 40 feet wide at the water surface level, 4 feet deep, and 28 feet wide at the bottom. On one side of the canal, there was to be a tow path for the mules or horses that would tow the boats on the canal. On the other side of the canal, there would be a dirt berm, making use of the dirt that had to be dug from the canal path itself. One of the most difficult parts of digging the entire Erie Canal was to get through the limestone rock of the so-called Niagara Escarpment at Lockport. This stone ridge was about 70 feet above the surrounding path of the canal. 50 feet of this stone ridge was negotiated by 5 consecutive locks, enabling a change of approximately 50 feet of the 70 feet of the ridge. The remaining 20 feet of the Niagara Escarpment was negotiated by blasting away some 20 feet of rise just west of Lockport. This accomplishment became known as the Great Dig, but it was really accomplished by use of blasting powder to break up the limestone, and then it was hauled away. Here in the Finger Lakes, one of the biggest obstacles to building this Erie Canal was the Montezuma Marshes. In the 1820s, it was known as the Cuga Marshes or 9 Mile Swamp. Despite Indians' warnings of the mosquitoes and illnesses that these mosquitoes brought, and despite the reluctance of local laborers to work on digging the canal through this area because of the swamp, Irish laborers were willing to take on the challenge. They were afraid of snakes, but not mosquitoes, they said. Since the water of the Seneca River that drained into the marshes varied depending upon the dry or wet seasons of the year, with it being much higher in the spring, the canal digging laborers sat around for 3 weeks in May 1821, waiting for the water level of the Seneca River and the marshes to go down. Another problem in these marshes was the unstable status of digging through the mud or dirt, trying to find a solid, hard bottom. Laborers worked all day in water above their knees. This made their legs swell. It made their legs a prime target for leeches. Another problem for the laborers, because of the summer heat and sunshine, the laborers worked shirtless and thus suffered from sunburn. When the mosquitoes came, there was a work stoppage from mid to late July. There were the so-called Montezuma necklaces, which were smudge pots to cause smoke to drive away the mosquitoes. But these Montezuma necklaces caused raw noses, and so on for the workers. Not surprisingly, many laborers were unable to work, to the point that in mid-1821 there was an advertising for 200 new workers because so many of the workers were unable to work. The lyrics of this poem suggest the ordeal of digging the canal, in some places just through gravel, in other places through marsh mire, and still other places on the route, such as solid rock. The base pay for canal diggers was 50 cents per day plus what is called found, or room and board, plus the daily ration of whiskey. Some workers, however, chose to work as a team in the hopes of earning a much higher wage if they worked really hard. For example, in 5.5 days, a good 3-man team could dig 50 feet of canal, including building a towpath on one side of the canal and a berm on the other. This would mean moving 250 cubic yards of dirt. Each team member doing this amount of work earned $1.88 per day. Now, another common misconception about the canal workers has been that they were almost entirely recent Irish immigrants. The reality, according to recent historians, is that approximately only 1/4 of the canal workers were actually of Irish descent. This scene shows the ceremonial wetting of the waters, with New York State Governor DeWitt Clinton on November 4th, 1825, pouring a keg of Lake Erie water into the New York harbor as the opening of the Erie Canal. Governor Clinton and other dignitaries, including the Marquis de Lafayette, shown as the right of the 3 main people in the center, had traveled that interment from the Buffalo terminus near the Erie Canal all the way to the Hudson River, and then down the Hudson River to the New York harbor. In these 2 visuals, you get an idea of what it was like for passengers to travel by boat on this new Erie Canal. You will note that the conditions inside the boat were rather crowded. Here you have still a better idea of how these boats utilized all available space. You will note that the sleeping units along the side of the boat left little room for a passenger to even turn over onto another side of his body as he was trying to sleep at night. A curtain was pulled across the boat to separate the sleeping areas of the ladies from the men. In the upper left picture, you see passengers sitting on top of the boat. That gave them a chance to get fresh air that they couldn't enjoy inside the boat. However, every time the boat came to a bridge, those passengers on the top of the boat would have to climb down because of the clearance of the bridge. As the lyrics in the song suggested, low bridge, everybody down. The bridges typically had only 7.5 feet of clearance above the water level of the canal. In this visual, you get an idea of what a freight boat looked like. You will note that there was a stable area. Every 10 to 15 miles, a new team of mules or horses had to be put into use to pull the boat along. So a pair of these animals would get off the boat to take on the new towing task, replacing a team that would then get into the stable part of the boat to the rest for the next 10 to 15 miles. In this drawing, you see a team of animals towing the boat. The team of animals was typically being led along the towpath by a young lad so as to keep labor costs down. He could work for less money or be made to work for less money than an adult man would want. Here you see an animal being loaded onto the stable portion of the boat. Here you get a good idea of how the Erie Canal greatly lowered travel costs and time. For example, traveling from Buffalo to Albany by road would take at least 15 days and often more. But by the new Erie Canal, it would only take 9 days at most. The cost of the shipping of freight was drastically lowered from $100 per ton to only $6 per ton. Transportation costs were so drastically cut by the Erie Canal that a shipment of flour could have traveled 2,750 miles before the cost would exceed 50% of its ultimate selling price. It is very important to understand that this new Erie Canal enabled agricultural produce from the entire Great Lakes area now to be much easier and more cheaply shipped to New York City and to Europe. Not surprisingly, the tonnage of grain reaching Buffalo from the west was 10 times what it had been just a decade earlier. This new Erie Canal made it possible for European and coastal U.S. goods to be shipped more cheaply and faster into the Finger Lakes and the Great Lakes region. For example, residents of Rochester could now get fresh oysters. As another example, salt produced in Syracuse, which became known as the Salt City, could now be transported west to help preserve meats in the growing west of the United States. The places along the Erie Canal mushroomed in population. You will see how Albany, Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse grew substantially in numbers from about 1825 when the canal opened to 1850. Not surprisingly, New York City became the largest city in the United States, largely because of this Erie Canal. One historian, Christopher Klein, has identified 8 ways that the Erie Canal changed the United States. Number 1, the Erie Canal opened the Midwest to settlement. The Erie Canal, number 3, transformed New York City into America's commercial capital. Number 7, perhaps more recent, the Erie Canal boosted the nascent tourist industry. And 8, it sparked a boom in canal construction. There were lots of canals built, but the Erie Canal soon had competition from the railroads. Railroads have the advantage that they can be built anywhere and they can operate all year round, unlike canals here in the northern part of the United States. The New York State Legislature tried to make the improved Erie Canal more competitive with the railroads by enlarging the canal and eventually abolishing tolls, but these efforts were not very successful. Here you see how the original canal was enlarged, with the first such enlargement being completed in 1862. Then there was a major reconfiguration and enlargement that was completed in 1918. This affects some places that is shown in the next frame. This map shows the changing path of the Erie Canal in these 3 different configurations of the Erie Canal. With the new path for the canal, some communities were no longer located on the Erie Canal. Here in the Finger Lakes, examples would be the communities of Weedsport and Port Byron. In the 3rd configuration, Syracuse was no longer on the Erie Canal. Where it had gone through downtown Syracuse, it was filled in and became Erie Boulevard. For many years, however, the Erie Canal that went through downtown Syracuse had a Waylock building, and it is shown here at top in 1903, and at the bottom, after the Erie Canal is no longer going through there, it became the Erie Canal Museum in 1962. Now, I had mentioned about aqueducts on the Erie Canal. Here is a drawing of the aqueduct in Rochester that carried the Erie Canal waters over the Genesee River. In the Finger Lakes area, there was the Richmond Aqueduct, which I will talk about in the other canals segment that accompanies this segment. If you look at the financial data shown in this frame, you can see that Clinton's critics about building this Erie Canal were vastly wrong. For many years, the Erie Canal was very profitable to New York State, with the state deriving a hefty profit from the construction costs compared to the toll's revenue. In the early 1900s, there was a major reconfiguration of the Erie Canal itself, and it became known as the Barge Canal. The Barge Canal system includes today all of the canals that are still in use that the state of New York owns. As some concluding comments, the Erie Canal doesn't exist officially as a name today. It is the Barge Canal. But the Erie Canal was a major, if not the major factor to make New York State the Empire State. As the historian Peter Bernstein put it, the Erie Canal was the first great bridge between the inexhaustible supplies of grain from the Midwestern United States and the inexhaustible demand for food from Europe in general and Britain in particular. In this quote, Peter Bernstein suggests that had this Erie Canal not been built, the Western territories may well have broken away from the coastal United States. In this quote, Peter Bernstein basically reminds us that we were a very young nation at the time this great Erie Canal was built. He also suggests that it helped contribute to what historians have come to call the manifest destiny of the United States to expand westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The United States Congress in 2000 established the Erie Canal National Heritage Corridor. You will note that it includes both Seneca and Cayuga Lakes. In conclusion, I hope you have enjoyed learning about the Erie Canal, which has been a major part of our Finger Lakes history. I hope you will want to watch the companion part of my canal story, a part that deals with the other canals in the greater Finger Lakes area.